time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics, presented by Cobranomics, your all-American American history teacher, gold standard of economics, and sensei of supply side, Professor G here. And today we have Unit 3, Lesson number 2, Economic Indicator number 2, the inflation rate. And inflation is one of the most complex indicators, and over this lesson it will take several parts to break it down. First, what is inflation? 2, how is it measured? 3, what causes inflation? And 4, why inflation is so devastating to many different aspects of the economy. And first, to explain what is inflation. Inflation is a decrease in the purchasing power of the dollar. And in 1896, Theodore Roosevelt went around the Midwest following Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan to explain why the William Jennings Bryan silver platform would be bad for the country and why it would cause inflation. But he had to explain inflation to crowds of people and explain it simply. So I'm going to use the exact analogy that Theodore Roosevelt did in 1896. Theodore Roosevelt literally went around the country touring with 2 loaves of bread. And he said, this is the loaf of bread you could buy on the gold standard. This is the loaf of bread you would be able to buy on William Jennings Bryan's silver standard, adding more free silver. So this is your bread with the regular purchasing power of the dollar, and this is your bread with inflation. Let's look at the 2 differences. So with inflation, what $1 can buy this year now cannot buy as much the following year. So without inflation, this is what your dollar can buy. However, inflation erodes the purchasing power of the dollar. So when inflation sets into the country, the same dollar that bought this loaf of bread now can only buy this loaf of bread. Meaning that higher prices are not the result of inflation. They're the result of inflation, not the cause of inflation. That it now takes more to buy this loaf of bread. So the higher prices are the result of inflation. Because the purchasing power goes down, that $1 can only now buy, with inflation, can only now buy this loaf of bread. It now takes more dollars to buy this loaf of bread, which used to be only $1. So it costs more to buy less, 2 loaves of bread. Non-inflation, inflation. A strong purchasing power, and then an eroded purchasing power of the dollar. We are going to take a look at how is it measured. And just like with unemployment, before we deal with the actual inflation rate, with unemployment we had to deal with the labor force participation rate. Before we deal with inflation, we have to take a look at, we have to create an index called the Consumer Price Index. And an index is when you take different numbers, more complex numbers, and break them down to a more manageable number. Like on your AP tests, you take 60 multiple choice questions, 20 free response points, and weight it to a number between 1 and 5, where 3 and above is your passing, and 1 and 2 are not passing. So with inflation, we are dealing with a massive amount of spending. So to make that a simple number, we are going to take this big number and put it to a number around 100. And what the Consumer Price Index measures is a market basket, which means a collection of 300 urban consumers. So very specifically, it is the urban consumer. It is only measuring consumer goods. And all consumer goods bought by the urban consumers. That includes imports, as well as includes foreign-made products that are sold in the store, American stores, as well as domestically made products. So there's a market basket of 300 urban consumer goods and services. And the CPI focuses on the urban consumer because it is the most dynamic economy, the city economy, with the greatest volume of goods and the greatest variety of goods. And all of these goods and services are weighted based on their industry and volume. And our formula for the CPI, so it's taking this massive amount of spending, weighting the industries and the volume based on these 300 goods and services, and making it a nice smaller number. Just like with the AP test, we take a bunch of moving pieces and break it down to a number between 1 and 5. Or like body mass index, taking height, taking weight, and putting it into a number from the teens to the 30s. And our formula for the CPI is we take the weighted cost of the current period divided by the weighted cost of the base period, times that by 100, and you have your consumer price index. And the CPI base year is always going to be 100. So it's an easy answer as a multiple choice on the AP test, because for the base year would be also the current year. So you'd have current divided by itself times 100 equals 100. So what we're looking for then is a number that is percentage-wise close to 100 to create that Humphrey-Hawkins full employment goal of price stability. So the inflation rate, now that we have the numbers we're working with, what the inflation rate is that percent difference in CPIs. If we have our base year as 100, what is the CPI of the year we're measuring? We want that to be a percentage, the price stability goal, we want that to be within 0 to 2% of that first CPI. So the inflation rate formula is percent change difference in CPI. CPI current minus CPI base divided by CPI base times 100. And what this gives you is that percent increase in CPI, that percent increase from market basket in your base period to the market basket in the current period. And really, what that gives you, right, we have a lot of moving pieces, but at its core, what it gives you is price stability, a percentage of price stability. That what is the percent, even though we're taking a look at what is the percent increase in consumer price index, what we're really taking a look at is what is the percent decrease in purchasing power. So as the CPI increases in a percentage, what is the percent decrease of the purchasing power of the dollar? And again, the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Act goals is that year over year, the CPI does not increase by more than 0 to 2%. And then 2%, if you think about it, is actually kind of a scary number. That means by the time you graduate high school, it is acceptable, from the time you start high school as a freshman to the time you graduate high school as a senior, the US government says it is acceptable that the purchasing power of your dollar has decreased by 8%. That is an acceptable number. That is a scary number. The two different causes of inflation. Our first cause is demand pull inflation. This is caused by an increase in demand. And that increase in demand is literally pulling up the price level. But it becomes bad so it's not necessarily bad at first, because this shows spending. An increase in demand, as we saw from Unit 2, is good. That means people are more willing and more able to spend money. So demand pull inflation is not necessarily bad at first. It shows that there is a general increase in the ability and willingness of consumers to spend. However, it becomes bad if the quantity demanded becomes greater than the quantity supplied, so that there's too much spending and that supply cannot keep up with demand. If this happens, so we are actually demanding beyond our ability to produce. And if that happens, you have a scenario in which you're going to have too much money chasing too few products. If there's not enough products, if not enough supply to meet the demand, well, now you're going to have that increase in price. And as this situation gets more severe, that increase in price, remember, the increase in price is a result of inflation, a result of that decrease in the purchasing power. So that increase in price is now going to be felt more severely. So demand pull inflation doesn't necessarily mean that it's not necessarily bad, but can become bad as soon as you have the quantity demanded outpacing a nation's ability to supply, to meet that demand. And then you're going to have too much money chasing too few products, and this is where you're going to have that increase in price level. The worst inflation, though, is what is called cost push inflation, whereas demand pull was the ability and willingness of consumers to actually spend more. Cost push inflation, there is a decrease in the ability and willingness of businesses to produce. So there's a decrease in supply. And so either there's an increase in input costs, there's a lack of availability of resources, something has happened where producers are not able to produce. So therefore, they are producing less. And since producers still have to, and since suppliers still have to profit from now less product, what do they have to do? They have to raise their prices. So businesses have to make, because something happened, they are not able to produce as much, and now they have to charge more to make more with less. And what this does is this actually creates an economic phenomenon, the most dangerous economic phenomenon, known as stagflation, in which you have those inflationary conditions, the increased price level, as you see prices are increasing as supply decreases. But look what else we also have. We also have that decrease in quantity. And with that decrease in supply, well, that means businesses are not producing, they're laying workers off. So now you have both problems at the same time. So cost push inflation directly leads to the worst economic scenario of stagflation. Not true with demand pull. In demand pull, the increase in demand is suppliers are meeting that initial increase in demand. So you're actually going to see a decrease in unemployment in the initial demand pull stages. However, in cost push, that decrease in the ability and willingness to produce creates the higher prices as businesses try to make more with less, and as they're decreasing their production, they're also laying people off. So you get the terrible phenomenon of stagflation. So stagflation, direct result of cost push inflation, the worst economic scenario a country can face, because the solution, which we're going to see when we get to fiscal policy, when you try to solve one, unemployment, you exacerbate the other, inflation. And when you try to solve inflation, you make unemployment worse using just fiscal policy. So it is the worst economic situation caused directly by cost push inflation. And now, regardless though, we are going to take a look at, aside from stagflation, now we're going to take a look at how this general increase in prices and how the erosion of, the main problem, the erosion of the purchasing power of the dollar, now we're going to take a look how that affects different aspects of the economy, how it affects households, how it affects businesses, how it affects banks, and how it affects the government.